Hello everyone, and welcome to the National Endowments for the Arts webinar on arts education and collective impact. My name is Ayanna Hudson, and I'm the Director of Arts Education for the NEA. Today we're going to focus on how to build collective impact initiatives. We have two distinguished guests joining us, Gigi Antoni, who's President and CEO of Big Thought in Dallas, Texas, and Denise Grande, who's Director of Arts for All in Los Angeles County, California. Both organizations are NEA grantees, and I will introduce both speakers in just a bit. A few months ago, the NEA hosted an arts education webinar with special guest John Kania, the co-author of a series of collective impact articles in Stanford's Social Innovation Review. In case you missed it, this webinar is archived on the NEA's website in the podcast, webcast, and webinar section. We had so much interest and so many questions from the field regarding how to begin collective impact initiatives that we decided to have our second webinar focus on the nuts and bolts of getting a collective impact initiative started. Today, our two guests, Gigi and Denise, will walk us through how they built from the ground up what are now model arts education initiatives using the power of collective impact. Before we begin, I'd like to tell everyone how the webinar will go today. First of all, you are all muted and will only be able to hear the presenters. You can submit questions or comments at any time using the Q&A box below the PowerPoint. We will do our best to address as many questions as possible during the time we have for the webinar. Please do not use the raise hand button. This webinar will be posted in the podcast, webcast, and webinar section of the NEA website in a few days, so you can refer to it in the future. Let me tell you now about the order of today's webinar. Gigi will get us started with her presentation. Then we will have a short Q&A session with Gigi. And then Denise will join us, and she will give a presentation, followed by a short Q&A with her as well. And finally, we will end with a combined Q&A with both of our guests. Today, we've asked Gigi and Denise to think about and address these three questions. What was the problem you were trying to solve? What was the spark that got you started? And how did you begin to solve the problem? These questions were used as a guide to help each speaker really think about the how they began this work. Because as I mentioned earlier, we really want to focus today's webinar on the nuts and bolts of getting collective impact initiatives started. So I'd like to begin by introducing our first speaker at this webinar, Gigi Antoni. Gigi has served for 17 years as the president and CEO of Big Thought and was named a champion of change by the White House. Gigi has become an eminent lecturer and consultant who assists cities and nonprofits throughout the U.S. and internationally to work towards innovative nonprofit delivery, moving beyond pockets of excellence into streamlined programs valued by communities as a whole. Now let me introduce you to Big Thought. For over 25 years, Big Thought has increased access to arts education so that a zip code does not determine a child's opportunity to thrive. Currently, they connect 100,000 families to after-school, summer, and in-school learning programs. Big Thought is well known for its role as a provider of resources and a vast collaboration of nonprofits. Big Thought has achieved national recognition, including Americans for the Arts 2009 Arts and Education Award and the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities Coming Up Taller Award in 2004. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to Gigi. Gigi?
Hello, there you go. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. So sorry. I want to say thank you for the kind introduction and also how honored I am to be here today talking to so many of you who are partners in this work across the country. The questions that we were asked to think about are really great ones, and I'm going to start with what was the problem. And I think that for Big Thought, the problem that we have been trying to work on for these 17 years is the need for equitable, high-quality arts learning that is really high impact for kids and valued by the community. We started this work in 1987, but the real collective impact work that we began to work in new ways was in 1997 with the launch of Dallas Arts Partners. And the spark that started that was that the city was creating a new cultural plan, and they asked a couple of really important questions, which was, how is the cultural community actually serving children? Who's being served? And is it having an impact on kids? And what is that impact, if there is? And really, it was just doing some research to begin to try to answer that question. Nobody had asked that question before. When we as a cultural community thought about our cumulative impact on kids, it looked like, if you looked at the aggregate numbers of the cultural institutions, that we were serving hundreds of thousands of children, but we were really serving the same 25,000 kids over and over again. And as we began to map what were those reasons that only certain kids had access, it really was basically along geographic and socioeconomic lines that were determining which kids had access and which didn't. And the fact that we had this data and could take it forward was really then the spark that made everyone in the community understand that we had actually sort of unknowingly, but had institutionalized a kind of access to arts learning that was based on socioeconomic factors rather than on having equitable access across the community. That was the spark that got us to come together as a community to solve that larger problem, a problem bigger than any individual agency could possibly impact, and that it was really clear that only together could we provide equity and break down those access barriers for kids. We began that work in '97, and the same kinds of inequities in other areas of our community persisted. In other words, we were able to provide equal access for every kiddo in the community to our city's cultural assets through arts partners, but we still didn't have guaranteed dedicated instruction in school for every child. And once again, as we began to look at that issue, we were able to map which kids had what and who didn't. And through that data collection, we were able to identify the gap. And then taking that gap forward, we were able to fill that gap, because once it was clear to the community, again, who did and didn't have access to this learning, it was, unpalatable to our community. And so it was something that we came together to try to address through our Thriving Minds in School work. We saw similar inequities in arts learning in after school and in summer. And so in 2008 and 2010, respectively, we came back together, again, using data and asset mapping to be able to articulate the gap, to come together as a community to try to fill that gap. The first steps in each of these efforts were really the same. And it was really to start talking to everybody who had a part of this issue, whether it was connecting to the cultural community and providing equity or learning in school or after school or summer. It's really was the same process. Collecting data, talking to folks, finding out where people were, what their point of view was from their different seats in the community, and then looking for surveys, interviews, and asset mapping, finding new information to help us build the story, and then doing a real inventory of what are the resources that already exist in the community that could be pulled together to address the gap. The second step is really to share the findings with influencers, people in the community who are in a position to provide leadership and to champion the effort going forward. So these folks work in our schools, in our city government, in our philanthropic community, people who are in a position to convene others. and then begin to share the findings with other possible partners, so other organizations that have resources, programs, personnel, facilities that would need to come together in order to fill that gap that we're trying to address. The next is much more public. It's really enlisting people into a movement to address the issue, and enlisting people in helping you to articulate what are the outcomes that this partnership will accomplish. At this point, the conversation is really about measurable outcomes. So we say, maybe in the learning and sharing part of this conversation, who's getting good instruction, where is it happening, what do you think are the people that we need to lead. But in this next, it's really enlisting everybody to help agree to the vision, the big steps that we would need to achieve it, and what sorts of outcomes we're really pushing for in trying to address this gap. The next stage is really about organizing and planning. And it's figuring out who in the community, what organizations are going to play what roles in the governance and steering of a citywide initiative. So it may be that there's a backbone agency that's going to play a certain role. Research and evaluation might be handled by a local university or other organization that has that capacity to take on that piece of the work. Coordinating programs, building curriculum, whatever the pieces are, who in the community are the right folks to do that, and how is that going to get organized to be able to do that? And going into a planning mode to implement something and creating the accountability measures that will be the shared outcomes that the community will take going forward. And this process I have seen in many places work very, very well. It may, the governance structure, the outcomes, the set of partners may be different in different efforts, but the process of finding the right people who have maybe an organizational agenda that actually gets promoted better in a collective effort than it does in an individual organizational effort. The big lessons, I think, the big sort of things that have to be thought about as you're engaging in this work in the community is how it's framed. So for instance, if you think about the first slide that I showed you, which had the Thriving Minds after school piece in it. So the framing for that program included arts learning, but it also included academic tutoring and intervention in combination with arts learning, and talked in the framing about addressing the level of engagement the kids had in learning through these two strands of instruction, academic supports, and fine arts instruction. So the framing for that was really different. I may come to that and say what I really care about is arts instruction. But when you're working in collective impact, you may need to think about larger civic outcomes so that the after-school program actually ties to the larger civic outcome of helping kids be more successful in matriculating through school, giving them the kinds of programming and support they need to be successful, rather than maybe arts outcomes, although we certainly track those as well because we want to make sure what we're doing is quality. The second is around funding. And there's already a lot of money being spent on, there was a lot of money already being spent on getting those 25,000 kids to all of the cultural organizations in the city. And that money was being spent by cultural organizations, building great programs, making them available to kids. So we didn't have to create something completely new and figure out how to pay for it. We had to figure out what was the incremental money that we needed to raise in order to be able to tie all of that existing investment together in a more powerful way. Accountability is a really big part, I think, of working in a collective impact model. There's lots of levels of accountability. So we look at student outcomes, but we're also looking at financial metrics. We're looking at how the quality of the work that we're doing and getting around a community definition of what we mean, understanding of what we mean about a quality program. There are many, many ways that accountability can help to raise both the access but also the impact on kids, but also the quality of the work and where that's happening in the community. I've been doing this a really long time, started in 1997, and the one thing that you can absolutely be sure of is that if you don't plan for big changes in governance, in funding models, in highly valued civic outcomes, the initiative will lose momentum. And so you may have one superintendent one year, you may have a different one 10 months later. Your mayor may change over. There's going to be big changes in leadership and in the environment that you're working in. And so to the extent that you can plan for that change up front and mitigate the impact of it as much as possible and adapt to the changing external environment, the more robust the program can remain, and you can build on success year over year. And the single most important thing that really surprises me all the time is how much communication is important in an initiative like this. There are people, you're basically leading a change movement. You're trying to change something that has been done one way and change it to be done in a different way in a collective impact model. And change makes people nervous. People need to understand the change. They need to understand the impact of it. So it's really important to keep people informed, communicate, both at an individual basis and at a community basis, what's happening with the initiative and what its challenges are, what its successes are going forward. And I think that is about all that I have in my prepared remarks, except that it is the single most rewarding professional experience that I've had to work with other professionals in this way. It can be difficult work, but very rewarding work, and it can make a really big difference for kids.
Gigi, thank you so much for your presentation. I'd like to begin now just our short question and answer period with you. We have some questions that have come in from the field. You know, I heard you say, and the participants on the webinar heard you say as well, really talk about your work as a movement. And this is a really interesting way to describe your work because you didn't use the word program. And the word movement, of course, really conjures up something bigger than ourselves. So how did you get people to understand this work as a movement? And fundamentally, I think within this question is, how did you get people to abandon their individual agendas at the door?
Well, I think it isn't a program. It is a movement because it's a collection of hundreds of programs, right, that are delivered to kids in new ways because you're not necessarily building a new experience for children, although there may be gaps in what's available in the community that need to be filled with new programs. But for the most part, it's really about pulling together the great programs in your community, combining them in different ways so that they have greater impact for kids, strengthening them, aligning them with particular outcomes, and then delivering them equitably. And so in order to do that, there has to be a big tent that's built for everybody to be able to bring their individual agendas to that big tent. So I'm not sure it's so much about abandoning them at the door and coming in with a new organizational agenda. It's about aligning in a very specific way the work that you're doing as an individual agency or entity or individual even, teaching artist, and figuring out how do you align that with others in a field of people doing this so that they're mutually supportive and they're actually reinforcing each other's agendas. Um, there are always, I think, some programs, some work in the community that can't be aligned with this agenda. For instance, Arts Partners in its beginning was only elementary school students. And so if you were an agency that was only serving high school students, there wasn't a place for you in the tent unless you wanted to build something new to bring in to the movement. But I think that these efforts are not just programmatic. They're also about advocacy and raising not a particular program agenda, but raising the agenda of what's important about arts learning and why should every child have a right to it in your community? Why should it not be happen chance whether you're going to have access to this or not? And I think there is a kind of element of a movement, of a political movement or of a social justice movement that gets built that we can come around and move that agenda forward. So I think it does feel more like a movement to me than a program.
Thank you, Gigi. And just to follow that up, can you talk about who was your most unlikely partner in the beginning?
Wow. There have been so many interesting, along the way. I think the strangest partner we had was the NFL because it seemed completely unrelated, and yet it wasn't unrelated. They had a need to engage children in meaningful ways in making a change in the community and the arts and this network, this movement of agencies and partners. We've reached out. We now have many youth development partners that we work with in this work. We also have healthcare and wellness partners that have come together in this work. So as the tent became bigger and bigger, it had room for more and more kiddos. There's a role that's catalytic that funders and others can play, like the NEA has been a catalyst for many of the steps that we've taken along the way. Certainly the Wallace and the Ford Foundation have been catalysts at different points, and local agencies like the school district who has said, we really want to focus on our summer school, for instance, and then being able to align all of the partners that are thinking about summer school with the arts and cultural partners and building something bigger than those two groups could have done together and more effective. So I think that looking way outside your field for partners that can be mutually reinforcing towards the outcomes that you're going for is a really great strategy.
Gigi, you just mentioned various funding partners. You mentioned the NEA, you mentioned Wallace, you mentioned the school district. But how did you secure funding to begin the work in its very early stages? Did you have a planning grant that enabled you to bring the community together to plan and to really develop the mapping and the data gathering?
I'm really glad you asked me that question, because I think often when we talk about our work, because we've been at it for so long, it looks like you need great big national funders or you need some sort of big investment to get this work off the ground, and I think that simply isn't true. Particularly, I mean, I've seen it actually over and over, but just going back to our beginning in 1997, this initiative began with no money. So it started with just looking at a data that was already available in the community about where kids were going and who was being served and with what services. So it really didn't cost a lot of money for us just to figure out what we already knew but weren't looking at. And when we did get money to get started, it was $50,000 from the city and $50,000 from the school district. So we had $100,000 and a group of partners. We served 13 campuses the very first year in a pilot. We spent about half the money on planning and development and about half on really enlisting schools and experimenting with us about how could we use community resources better, how might teachers like to see it delivered to them, what kind of professional development might they need to make the best use of the resources. That was the beginning of the program. In 5 years, it was scaled to 156 campuses, 100,000 children, mostly with public money that was already being spent on field trips and excursions in the school district, but not in a very efficient or way that could be measured or even accounted for.
Great, thank you, Gigi. Can you talk a little about how Big Thought involves smaller nonprofits? What role do they have at the table, especially once you were beginning this work in its early stages?
So I think it's really important when I talk about when we talk about the sharing out and then the building a vision and beginning to outline outcomes and success. It's really important that every sort of strata of the cultural community is a part of that conversation. Individual artists that may be working in the field, or your teaching artist community, all sorts of nonprofits, everything from the large cultural institutions to institutions that are based in neighborhoods and communities and everything in between. So there needs to be a very broad community conversation about setting vision and goals. Then when you get into organizing the work and people are beginning to think about what role they might play, again, you want to keep that bridge, you want to keep that tent really as large as you can, and begin to help people engage with the actual planning of the work. If you don't do that, if you don't have everyone, or at least key representatives of each of those stakeholder groups at the table, you're likely to design something that won't work for a smaller organization, or it won't work for a larger organization. So I think in that phase of the work, it's really important to make sure that you're not leaving out an important component.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gigi. We're going to now move to our second speaker, Denise Grande. Denise Grande is the Director of Arts for All at the Los Angeles County Arts Commission. Before joining Arts for All in 2012, she spent several years at Lincoln Center as Director of Programs and Strategic Partnerships for the Metropolitan Opera Guild. Prior to her work in New York, Denise served in multiple leadership roles in education at the Music Center, Performing Arts Center of LA County for nearly 2 decades. And now let me introduce you to Arts for All. Arts for All, a program of the Los Angeles County Arts Commission, is a collaborative initiative established to ensure that the 1.6 million public school students throughout the county have access to quality sequential arts instruction as a part of ongoing K-12 curriculum. Since its inception in 2002, Arts for All has helped school districts implement and sustain arts education. Recognized as a national model for arts education reform by Americans for the Arts, Arts for All is now working with 52 of Los Angeles County's 81 school districts, serving over 570,000 students in this coordinated community-wide approach. Now, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Denise.
Good morning. Ayanna, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting Arts for All to the conversation. It's interesting to me to hear really some clear similarities and some clear differences between the approaches of Arts for All and Big Thought. So to really target in on some of the nuts and bolts of starting Arts for All, what was the problem we faced? Many of you are probably aware of a landmark tax reform legislation that was passed in California in 1978 that cut property taxes across the state. And this really had huge implications for education overall, and particularly in arts education. The result was that we had nearly 25 years of gutting of arts education from the public school context, which by the turn of the century meant that we had a full generation of California teachers who very likely had completed their entire K-12 public education with little or potentially no exposure or instruction in the arts. So that was really the problem that we were facing in 1999-2000. Before I go further, just to give a context for our region, LA County is a larger overarching regional entity. We are made up of 88 different distinct municipalities spanning over 4,000 square miles. There are 81 different school districts in LA County that serve over 2,400 schools. LA Unified is our largest district, second largest in the country, and often gets most of the press and media coverage, but it is only one of 80 other school districts. And these districts range from just under 350 schools, a district that really is a single school district, to districts that serve 5 schools, 40 schools, and then all the way up to LAUSD, which now serves close to 900 K-12 schools. So the spark that got us started was that in the late 1990s, LAUSD, again our largest school district, had been very forward-thinking and launched implementation of a 10-year strategic plan with the sole vision of restoring arts education to its more than, at that time, 800 different schools. So that really prompted arts leaders from throughout the country to wonder whether the other 80 school districts in the region could be encouraged and supported to follow suit. So therein was formed an Arts Education Task Force Steering Committee. And this was made up of key arts education and education leaders in the field. And as they began to discuss the prospect of changing arts education in all of these schools across the country, there was one thing that became very clear, and that was that they didn't know what they didn't know. And there had been a lot of assumptions about where arts education stood and what did and didn't exist. But it wasn't really clear whether these assumptions were accurate or not. So in 2000, Arts for All began in-depth interviews with superintendents in each of these 81 school districts. And the result was a more clear picture of the current reality. And that was that although there were really strong examples of really high quality work happening, those examples did exist, it was very uneven and it was very inequitable, which resulted in some students having some access to some of the art forms some of the time. So our first step in solving the problem was to really embark on a planning process. And I have to say it really was a genuine planning process, because at that time the Arts Commission was not perceived, nor did it really have a history or expertise in arts education. That was key because it allowed us to really be a neutral party in convening community experts. We didn't have our own agenda outside of the broader overarching goal of ensuring quality arts education for all students. So we began with a series of stakeholder meetings, and there were 8 of them. The first 3 were sector-specific, so gathering policy makers distinct from implementers, distinct from recipients of arts instruction. The policy makers were, as you would expect, elected officials, state legislators, county officials, and school board members. But it also included representatives from several municipal arts commissions and representatives from our state universities, both the UC system and the California State University system, and superintendents, and local arts education funders who we knew had key influence over many of the arts organizations that they were funding and how they were crafting their guidelines, through how they were crafting their guidelines for funding. The implementers were the school district directors of curriculum instruction, school district arts coordinators, of course, principals. We have something in Los Angeles called school site councils, which are leadership team, local school-based leadership teams, so we had representatives from those sectors. Certainly teachers, arts organizations, and administrators, professional artists, and then also representatives from higher education, but this time those that were particularly focused on training teachers. And then finally the recipients included parents, students, PTA leadership, but also employers who stood to benefit from a better educated workforce. So following those 3 distinct stakeholder meetings, we also convened a series of 5 different regional meetings across the 5 supervisorial districts of the county, and those were all mixed stakeholder groups. Our statement of vision and our shared beliefs really emerged in these sessions. It was a very, very messy process, and the values and vision and belief system changed from meeting to meeting. It was kind of throwing everything up, getting input, and then revising it and taking it to the next meeting a little refined. But what this really vetted is that it allowed the disagreement among the experts in the room and the stakeholders in the room to really help codify the areas of agreement for moving forward. And what surfaced was that there was really no one right way to do this work. And so it was important to create a framework that would allow all who wanted to be involved to be involved. To Gigi's point, how can we build the tent big enough to really include all interested stakeholders? So what emerged in 2002 was our strategic plan, the Los Angeles County Regional Blueprint for Arts Education, and that built coalitions around 4 key goals, which actually still guide our work today, 11 years later. Those 4 goals are to help districts build their own infrastructure for supporting arts education. To us, that has meant helping them develop a local policy, strategic plan, and to designate specific dollars, and that those policy plan and budgets are adopted by local school boards. The second focus area was to improve the quality of teaching and learning. The third was to make sure that parents, students, community, and industry leaders had the tools that they needed to continue to advocate for arts education in their schools. And then finally is to align funding efforts, regional funding guidelines, so that all arts education providers were being held to the same bar and standard of quality in arts instruction. Our goal was truly for all students to receive a quality education. And for us, that meant that we needed to focus on arts instruction during the school day. And the genesis of that is that we know that only 30% of students in LA County even participate in after-school programming, and a much smaller percentage of those programs even deal with or offer the arts. So if we wanted to stay true to the goal of all arts for all students, then we had to be we had to aspire to change the system. And that meant working at the district level to change the system from the inside and to have the external community support those systems. And then finally, just some other key parts of this story. We would be remiss if we did not give credit and acknowledge LAUSD, who really served as a visionary at that time. They provided a strong roadmap, really setting a standard with this idea of a board-adopted policy, a board-adopted strategic plan with a designated budget. The second thing that I think is key to pass along is that Arts for All has not, at any step along the way, been interested in telling any of these 81 school districts how to do this work. Instead, our approach has been to provide a model framework and then allow and encourage customized implementation to provide resources and funding that can support local level work. And then finally, I feel I need to acknowledge that this whole idea of backbone organization really is truly an ebb and flow of shared leadership. And it's a nuance, but it really is a delicate dance between knowing when to lead from the front and when to lead from the behind. The collective impact material talks about leading from behind, but there are key moments when it actually is important to lead from the front, and knowing how and when to do that are really key. The growing pains of this don't make the work always clear or easy, and I agree with something else that Gigi said, which is, some of the real challenges deal with keeping the partners on the train that's moving forward on the same track over the long haul. But I will close with that much of the groundwork that was laid in 2001, 2002, is absolutely still central to our work today. So it's kept us very focused and clear moving in a forward direction.
Thank you, Denise, so much. I'd like to now begin our short question and answer period with you. You mentioned something interesting in your presentation. You said that LA County didn't have the expertise in arts education. I'm going to ask you to dig a little deeper into this. Without the expertise, why did LA County take on this work, and how did LA County develop its internal capacity? And I think the capacity question relates also to something Gigi mentioned, and a question was posed to her in terms of how do you get the funding to actually start this kind of work? And I'm really curious about the LA County story, especially because you stated explicitly that LA County did not have the expertise.
So, as I mentioned, that works to our benefit because we were a neutral party able to convene community experts. And at that time, there was actually a lot of tug and pull amongst arts education providers and stakeholders in the county. So to come in as a neutral party and to really defer to the community experts allowed us to really listen and hear from all of them, but put us in a position to actually move forward without being perceived as having our own hidden agenda. In terms of developing our internal capacity, the first step was to hire somebody with a significant arts education experience, in the spirit of full disclosure, was Ayanna Hudson. And like Gigi, there was not a lot of money around the table. It was an initiative that started with no money and just some data, and then a small grant, very small, from the California Arts Council provided funding for this one staff person to really start moving the process forward. And it really, I think, drills home the point that whatever you do, you need staff. You need some staff, and that volunteerism kind of will only ever go so far.
Thank you, Denise. Here's another question. You know, LA County is a really interesting case study because, as you mentioned in your remarks, it has every size school district that exists across the country within its geographic boundaries. Can you talk about how Arts for All was committed from the beginning to serving small rural school districts with 337 students to large urban school districts with 660,000 students at the same time? Are there similar strategies that have been used to support small rural school districts as well as large urban school districts?
Yes, and that's really grounded in the fact that Arts for All does not actually provide arts education services to any schools. We don't view ourselves as an arts provider. We view ourselves as a body that is trying to align these other resources. So one of our key strategies has been to give resources to school districts in both people and funding to allow them to really cultivate and develop their own local implementation plans. So one example of this is that when a school district first joins Arts for All, we provide them with a facilitator or consultant that helps walk them through a group of their community stakeholders through the process of developing a policy for arts education, developing a strategic plan, and then taking that to their local school board. So that emphasis on local ownership, local implementation, many right ways of doing this work, and having it be really tailored and customized to the needs of that local community has probably been the most key piece and way for us to really move the county as a whole.
Thank you. And in follow-up to that question, how did Arts for All deal with turnover at the district level that has been so prevalent since the earliest stages of the work of Arts for All?
So it's an ongoing process. One of the advantages is that as we have superintendent turnover, we're such a large region, it's actually not uncommon for superintendents to move from one LA County school district to another LA County school district, and they tend to move from the smaller districts to larger districts. So in some ways, some of the capacity building amongst superintendents has allowed us to sustain the work as they've moved. But it also is a constant, there's a need for a constant reiteration and a constant circling back to make sure that as that turnover happens, we're inviting and including the new superintendents in the conversation. Not just superintendents, but to have strategies for the superintendent level, the director of curriculum and instruction level. We have regular ongoing, right now they're quarterly meetings of arts coordinators throughout the district. So it's really an ongoing cycle of continuing to support district leadership in a variety of ways.
Thank you, Denise. You mentioned and talked about shared leadership, and you described it, as a backbone organization. And I want to go a little deeper with this idea. Can you talk about who or which partners are involved in shared leadership and describe the role of LA County in this model of shared leadership or this model of a backbone organization?
So in the early days, it really was the County Arts Commission serving as to staff this collaboration of partners. And again, in the early days, it was partners that had resources to contribute in a collaborative way. So at that time, it was the California Alliance for Arts Education. It was the Music Center, which is a major arts institution here in LA with more than 25, at that time, with more than 25 years of experience already working in schools. There was, of course, our LA County Office of Education, which is a oversight body for the 80 school districts. But it was also Arts for LA, an advocacy organization, and funders, one of which was Sony Pictures. And many funders were already directing dollars towards arts education. So part of the thinking is how can we bring them all around the same table so that they're aligning their efforts. Many of the key leadership of that time, or the key partners, are actually still involved in the initiative now. Over the decade, they've served as part of what we call our executive committee to really guide and inform the work, and that continues to be in place.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Denise. With the time that we have left, we're now going to have question and answer with both of our guests. And I have a question that I like to pose to both Gigi and to Denise. From both presentations, I really heard clearly that your collective impact work is grounded in data collection, really revealing the strengths and gaps or opportunities, in planning and in partners. And I want to ask each of you to reflect for a moment on what mistakes you made early in your work in any of these areas. What did you learn? And the big idea behind this question really is, how did you fail forward? So I'd like to first ask Gigi to reflect and to share her answers to this question. Gigi, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I sure can. So many failures forward, it's hard to even figure out which ones to talk about. I think just the whole concept of failing forward is a really important part of this work. So making it okay to even put something out there to test and then come back and say, this part worked, this didn't work. And I think that whole iterative piece is really, really important. So here's some big mistakes we made. I think we did a really great job of building the tent big enough for the initial Arts Partners initiative, and then also for the work of getting sequential arts education policies in place for our kids. I think when Thriving Minds, after school and summer came along, those two opportunities, I think we felt like the partnership was mature enough and that the governance piece of it was in place strongly enough that it could just be leveraged for this new work. And in fact, we should have gone backwards maybe and redone some of the work, because there were so many new partners coming on that because we were working with youth development and we were working with different parts of the school district that we hadn't worked with in the previous initiatives. I think we thought that we could just sweep that along, and in fact that groundwork of building those relationships, having people have input on the process of planning and setting vision, articulating outcomes, the first part of that work, I think we learned was maybe the most important part of the work, and that there was something that happened in relationship building and in partnership building, really understanding partners' agendas, not assuming that we were on the same page, and trying to cut corners and go faster. I think actually we ended up spending more time going back and repairing maybe some of the communication and partnership building that we should have done better in the first iteration. So I'm talking now about, it's easier to do this work if you get 6 people that really know what they're doing in a room and just figure it out. And it seems really difficult to pull everybody together and keep having those conversations over and over again. But you either do it up front in building buy-in and commitment, or you have to go back and do it to get people on board to actually implement it. I think that's a big lesson that we learned, and that we probably will never make that mistake again.
Thank you so much, Gigi. Denise?
I'm going to speak specifically to data collection on this one. And that is that when we started, we were periodically circling back to look for progress on 5 key indicators that were really at the school district level. And several years in, we realized that we needed to also be digging deeper than that, that the district level questions and data collection were serving an important need, but we also needed to get to quality. So we began sort of a bimodal or 2 strands to this work, continuing the larger scale district data collection, but then also driving classroom by classroom, school by school, and having the quality of what's happening in each of those classrooms surface up to also inform the state of the work in the district. So I guess our big learning was paying attention to how much is being provided and the quality to which it's being provided, and then also the top-down as well as bottom-up, and that both are important and serve different roles and are both needed.
Excellent. Thank you, Denise. Here's another question, which I think, given our time, will be our final question that I'd like to pose to both of our presenters. Really thinking about the conversation we've had today in terms of nuts and bolts and how you begin collective impact initiatives, how did you define success and how did you document the work in both of your initiatives? And really getting to the idea of how do you define success and dealing with long-term systemic initiatives? How do you define success early on? Gigi?
Okay, so I think that it is really important to define success as the ultimate outcome 5 years, 10 years down the road, but then to have very early and frequent benchmarks that are definitions. Okay, we're on track, this is the right. And often for us, that was outcome-based, but it was also learning-based. So it was being able to say, we're going to start in these 13 schools, we're going to experiment, and these are the things that we're trying to learn, or the problems we're trying to solve that are really design problems around how the initiative needs to be put together, or building policies that need to be put together, and really making those visible, again, through your communications. And talking about success on lots of different levels, on a planning level, on an implementation level, and on an outcome level. And so that there's, every 6 months there's a success, something you've learned or something that's failed that you're going back to fix, and that it's this iterative nature of the work and that it builds on each other. So we had big goals that had to do with every child getting access. Then we had goals about the quality and raising the quality of what we were giving kids access to, getting policies in place. Those were our big major goals that we were looking at. But there were incremental goals even between those. So I think, often setting goals, reaching them, and keeping that big long-term goal in mind.
Thank you, Gigi. Denise?
So we shared the same big goal as Gigi, which is this very large all arts for all kids. And in the early days, many around the table, in all honesty, weren't really sure that it was even going to be possible. So our success indicators from the beginning were around this idea of more districts coming on board, adopting policies, adopting plans. Right now we have 52 of the 80 districts that are on board and have adopted a policy and a plan. And so one measure was just that increased number. But also we were looking at other district commitment. So how many districts were making space in their district administrative office for arts coordinators. One of the other things we've wanted to look at is commitment of budget towards the arts. That's been very challenging for us, one, to collect that data, but especially in the last fiscal year since 2008, really difficult in the LA County hard-hit recession context. But those are a few of our measurements for success. I think at this point, 10 years in, we're also looking to broaden what does success look like, because as we scale up and we are looking towards hitting all 81 school districts with policy plans and engaged in the work, how will that change our success indicators?
Thank you so much, Denise, and thank you, Gigi. That's all the time we have for today. And again, I would like to sincerely thank both Gigi and Denise for joining us and sharing real insights into how to start collective impact initiatives. I hope our audience enjoyed and learned a lot from today's conversation. I know I did. If you would like to learn even more about Big Thought and/or Arts for All, please visit the respective websites that are listed on this slide. Please remember that this webinar, including the PowerPoint slides, will be archived permanently on the NEA website if you'd like to reference it in the future, or if you would like to share it with your colleagues and partners. Thank you so much for joining us today.